Folks, you've heard him on the program before. We always love to have Dan on. Dan Perkins is a historian. He's a contributor to thehill.com. He's a writer, author of the Brotherhood of the Red Nile trilogy, which centers around Islamic nuclear terrorism against the United States. And he joins us now. Dan Perkins, how are you, sir?
Good morning. And how are you this morning?
I'm doing fantastic. It's always great to talk to you, sir, and appreciate you coming on, spending some time with us. I wanted to talk about this story with you about Iran. And I got a headline here from the Wall Street Journal. U.S. commander wants to beef up military presence in the Middle East to counter Iran. But it's actually more than that. I see here on the front page of the Drudge Report right now, we have a tanker torpedo attack in the Strait of Hormuz. We have crews who've abandoned ship. We have U.S. Navy in assistance. The Middle East is on alert. Oil prices have surged. What can you tell us about this breaking news event?
What's going on is distraction. And what I mean by distraction is that the real issue here in Iran, which is not really being talked about, is the effectiveness of what Donald Trump did with the restrictions that he put on when he withdrew from the nuclear arms agreement. So we have a situation where the government, and this is really a very important thing that's happening. It is a Sharia-compliant nation. In fact, it is the largest population of Shia Muslims in the world, in the country of Iran. There are two sects within the Muslim philosophy, Shia and Sunni. Sunni being the largest, and countries like Saudi Arabia are Sunni. And the Sunnis and the Shias have been arguing and fighting and disagreeing for about 1,300 years. Mm-hmm. But what's going on is we have a situation right now which is unprecedented. And that is that the religious leaders who run the government, the imams and the ayatollahs, are under enormous amount of pressure from the, let's call it, the average citizen, because the quality of life in that country has just been destroyed. Now, what I mean is we have, for young people, a 40% unemployment rate. We have a situation where the value of the currency dropped 60% last year. 60% in 12 months.
Wow.
So the currency is being destroyed. Inflation is off the charts. And when they first put the sanctions in place, Mr. Trump effectively reduced the revenue from the sale of oil by about 75%. When they were involved in some incidents earlier this year, you may recall that the president, and there were 10 nations that were exempt under the restrictions that the president put in, so that Iran could continue to trade oil with them. He shut them down. He said it all. So that what you have is a country that is collapsing rapidly, and a government. And what's historically significant here is that we have the churchgoers rebelling against the leadership. And last year there were over 25 massive protests in the country of Iran, people protesting the government, meaning they were protesting the mullahs and the religious leadership. So what we have is a government under attack because they can't provide the services, they don't have the income, and as a result, the people are angry, so they have to distract.
Yeah.
They have to try and distract the people away from the problems that the government has to doing other things. Now, the Straits of Hormuz is where a significant portion of Middle Eastern oil is shipped. And it's always been a contention that if Iran wanted to create a problem, they could attack ships in the Straits of Hormuz. It's not that big and easily controlled. So what's going on is, again, a continuation of the distraction process, and which is causing, in the other parts of that region, some very interesting alliances that are taking place, because, if you may recall, last week, the Iranian government said that they could have a nuclear weapon in probably 6 months. Now, those of us who disagreed with the Obama administration's agreement and the lies that we were told about the capabilities of the Iranian government to produce a nuclear weapon, that they were 10 years out if they complied with the agreement, and they were supposedly complying. It was fascinating under that agreement, if you recall, the compliance to the agreement was left to them to police themselves. That no outside observers could police what was going on. The point now is that things have gotten incredibly difficult within the country. As I said, with the inflation and unemployment and no money, you're rapidly seeing, in essence, the evolution of another Venezuela. This time it's called Iran.
Really? Wow. That's incredible. So you say there's some interesting alliances that are going on. Obviously, we know
Yes.
Saudi Arabia has no love for Iran.
Right.
But I've heard some articles, that there's kind of an unspoken cooperation going on right now between the Saudis and the Israeli government. Do you know anything about
Absolutely. I was going to talk about that. Thanks for throwing me that softball.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, the Saudis again. What it's really all about, more than anything else, and this is I've written about this several times. I write for probably about 15 different blogs, The Hill and Clash Daily and Newsmax and on and on and on. And what I'm writing about is, it's really about oil. See, up until about 2 years ago, we had, for the last 75 years, been dependent on foreign sources of oil for our energy. And many industrialized nations around the world were in a similar position. So we became pawns of the whims of the OPEC oil ministers. I'm sure you remember the 2 times that we had oil embargoes against us in the United States, where we had rationing. It was because we were importing 65% of our energy needs from OPEC. And so they had tremendous power and influence, and they could influence the economies of the world by throwing the switch on or off in terms of making crude oil available. When, in spite of the Obama administration, American private sector oil companies developed fracking and developed the ability to produce massive amounts of crude oil and natural gas, we quickly became energy independent. First time in 75 years. Mm-hmm. And then we began to grow our capacity. We became the largest producer of crude oil in the world. And then we started exporting, competing directly with OPEC. And I did a piece, it's on my website, danperkins.guru, called The New Sultan in Town. It used to be that the power for energy and its influence rested in Saudi Arabia as the lead country in OPEC. But the new Sultan of oil doesn't live in the Middle East. He lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Donald Trump. Because America is now totally independent, does not require any oil coming from the Middle East to sustain itself, changed it as a huge, huge shift in the power and the influence. So when you look at Venezuela, you look at the country that had probably some of the most largest reserves in the world. Granted, it was a terrible crude called molasses crude, hard to process, but still had huge reserves. They are now not a net exporter of crude oil. They are a net importer of crude oil. You look at Nigeria and you look at many other OPEC nations are in economic deterioration to the point that the governments are difficult to survive. Now, we had two examples in the last 6 months where crude oil reached about 65, 66 dollars a barrel. And Donald Trump said to Saudi Arabia, cut the price. And they did. So we have the money, we have the resources, and we have the energy. The decline from $66 a barrel to $53 a barrel was devastating to the economies of all the OPEC nations because the revenue that's generating is costing them more to bring it out of the ground than what that they're selling it for.
So the OPEC nations are upset about this, no doubt. We're talking with Dan Perkins, but Saudi Arabia seems to be okay with it, or at least bin Salman does, right?
Yeah, well, and they understand they don't really have any choice. I mean, if you want to be really practical about it, the Saudis could bitch and moan, and probably in some quarters they are, but they realize that the world has changed. The rest of OPEC has not. Russia hasn't. Qatar and a bunch of other nations who have seen a tremendous decline in their revenue and hardship to their people don't believe what's going on. And so it's a problem. The Saudis are extremely practical. Mm-hmm. The Saudis, as you said a few moments ago, believe that Iran is a potential nuclear threat to the Middle East, and it needs new partners, and you are absolutely correct that they are working closely with the Israelis to gain intelligence as to what's going on in the nuclear program because they're going to have to do something, and they want the Israelis to help them.
The situation right now, again, there has been a tanker who has been, according to reports, torpedoed. Reuters is reporting that 2 oil tankers were hit in suspected attacks in the Gulf of Oman. Shipping firms and industry sources said, sending oil prices as much as 4% higher a month after 4 other tankers were damaged by mines in the region. One of the tankers, the Front Altair, carrying a cargo of petrochemical feedstock, was ablaze in waters between Gulf Arab states and Iran. Iran State News Agency said it had sunk, although the Norwegian owners had said it was afloat. Matter of fact, we've got photos of this thing over at NBC. They're reporting an American guided missile destroyer was sent to assist 2 burning tankers following what the U.S. Navy described as a reported attack in the Gulf of Oman Thursday. And the photos are pretty spectacular. There's one over on Drudge right now. So do you think this is Iran essentially? I mean, if their economy is dying, if the country's dying, if there's unrest within Iran, that our media is not going to cover, by the way. They don't want any sort of actual liberation of Iran because they believe somehow in the Obama doctrine of giving them pallets of different currencies, on an airplane.
Right.
So do you believe that they're just kind of lashing out here? I mean, to me, that doesn't sound like that would be a very wise thing for them. But what do you think?
Well, yes, they are lashing out, and they're lashing out, as I said earlier, for the distraction. Let me just take what you just said for a moment and try and put it in a perspective for your listeners. You said that oil prices went up 4%.
Yes.
At a time where America was not energy independent, at a time when America was not beginning to supply oil to the rest of the world, had that incident have happened, oil prices would not have been up 4%. Oil prices would have been up 20%.
Okay. So that makes sense. So you're saying because of President Trump moving us into a more energy independent position, their little temper tantrums are not as relevant to us.
That's correct. They're not relevant at all. And the other thing is that happened in the last attack that you were talking about. The Yemen these were Saudi tankers, and Yemen took the responsibility, the terrorists there, for the attack on the tankers. But this is another problem because it's that group of people, the Yemen terrorists, who are being supported by the Iranian government, which outraged the Iranian people again, because you're spending our money with providing terrorism. You're not giving us food. You're not giving us electrical power. You're not finding jobs for us. You're not doing anything for us. You're sending our money out of the country for terrorist activities. And if you recall, when we were negotiating, when Kerry was negotiating the agreement, the Iranian negotiator would come out of the meeting and he'd say, "Death to America." How many times have we heard death to America? The cry now in Iran is death to the dictators.
Wow.
The government of Iran.
Dan Perkins, it's always great to have you on, sir. I appreciate your insight, especially, we had you planned to come on but before any of this stuff happened again in the Strait of Hormuz. We really appreciate it. It's always great to talk to you. I'd encourage everybody to get your books, The Brotherhood of the Red Nile Trilogy, and check out all of your stuff, especially at thehill.com. We appreciate it, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
I appreciate your information and insight. Folks, we're going to take a break here.